Welcome back to the Real News Network. I'm Paul Jay. Joining us again are Paul Fitzgerald and Elizabeth Gold, journalists and authors and documentary producers. And their last book on Afghanistan is Invisible History, Afghanistan's Untold Story. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you for having us, Paul.
It's great to be here.
So in the first segment of the interview, we talked about Wikileaks and quite these accusations being made that Pakistan's not fighting the Taliban enough, and are they actually conspiring? And we talked a bit about Hamid Gul, the former ISI head, who we know was involved originally in the 80s in helping create the Taliban. But let's go back to the beginning. Elizabeth, talk a little bit about how this all started. How did the Mujahideen in Afghanistan get armed?
Well, I think you really have to go back to the early 1970s, when Gulbuddin Hekmatyar, who we already mentioned, has been an active Afghan fighter who really started in the early 70s, separating from Afghanistan. He ended up in trouble, ended up killing another Afghan over political issues at Kabul University, ended up in jail, and eventually found his way to Pakistan after he was released from jail. And he began to work with the Pakistani intelligence. The funding started at that point. The United States, the Saudis were already funding this kind of activity. Ahmad Shah Massoud was another one who was a part of the attempt to start the destabilization of Afghanistan from the Pakistani side. So this all preceded by.
So let's talk about why the Americans wanted to do that.
This was actually all focused on the Cold War. There was clearly a belief that the Afghans were too close to the Soviets. There's a lot of history to really show that the Afghans really didn't have any choice, but this became a Cold War issue.
Yeah, just to give it some context. I mean, Afghanistan essentially at that time bordered the Soviet Union, and you have a pretty active communist movement in Afghanistan, and at a certain point the communist government come to power, I think more or less in an election.
But not in 73, though.
In 73, the Parsham faction of the Marxist People's Democratic Party of Afghanistan put together a coup with the king's cousin, Mohammed Daoud, who had been the former prime minister of Afghanistan and had been asked to step down because of his fierce nationalism by the king in 1963. So you had this era for 10 years, from 1963 to 1973, of what was called the experiment in democracy. Well, Daoud ended that with the help of the communist faction of the PDPA called Parsham, which was Barbara Karmal. Okay, and Barbara Karmal in 1979 was the man that the Soviets instituted as their so-called puppet to control the country after their invasion. But there's a whole lot of stuff that went on between 1973 and the Soviet invasion that kind of gets glossed over in the Western tellings of Afghanistan, and that's where the real meat of this issue really.
When I interviewed Brzezinski, and if people watching this want to go later and watch my Brzezinski interview, his major point was we may have helped facilitate the Russians moving into Afghanistan, but the resistance was spontaneous, and they really would have invaded anyway, so all we did is sort of speed up the process, and by doing that he means arming the Mujahideen in Afghanistan so that it became such a threat to this pro-Russian Afghan government that the Russians had to come in. What do you make of that? That's really, I think, their basic story.
Well, there are other sources of information besides Mr. Brzezinski. He's trying to downplay his own personal involvement in it. And there are others. I mean, Robert Gates is an example. Our current Secretary of Defense wrote in his own book, From the Shadows, that the United States was actually actively trying to instigate an involvement of the Soviets from 1978, 1979 on.
Yeah, they actually use the phrase that we'll give the Soviets their own Vietnam.
Their own Vietnam, and he talks extensively about the various issues that were going on inside the Pentagon and the CIA about what would be the benefit of having the Soviets invade Afghanistan. In fact, he gives that question out, or that question goes out to one of his people, and the guy comes back about a month later, and he said, There's no downside to this at all. He said we get to look great in the Americans get to look great in the Islamic world. We get to badmouth the Soviets wherever they are. We can use this as a propaganda heyday. And if you look into the archives, you can get these archives too at the Wilson Center as an example. You can look at what Brezhnev and Kosygin and the various people in the Politburo were talking about from 1978 to up until the Soviet invasion, and they're scratching their heads saying, we can't figure this thing out at all. At one point, one of these people says it reads like a detective novel, what's going on in Afghanistan. Now, you had, of course, Hafizullah Amin, the man who eventually was overthrown by the Soviets, was definitely perceived by the Russians as being an agent of the Central Intelligence Agency. The US's own ambassador, Adolf Dubs, was so convinced that Hafizullah Amin, was a Central Intelligence agent that he actually went to his own agency chief at the embassy, station chief at the embassy, and demanded information as to whether he was. Of course, his chief said, no, he's not working for us. But they put out the perception with propaganda, got the KGB and the GRU to believe that Amin was in fact a CIA agent. And as things got worse, as the conditions in Iran, as an example, worsened, the Soviets really began to believe that the United States was going to invade Iran and then push into Afghanistan, and Hafizullah Amin was going to be the means by which they were going to do that. So that was their thinking. They got rattled. They voted, I think it was 5 times against invading Afghanistan. And then finally they said, look, their generals came forward. Paul Warnke told us this, the man who negotiated the SALT II treaty, told us personally. He said the Russians, the military leadership came to the Politburo and said, look, we're not getting anywhere with the United States. SALT isn't going to be ratified by the Congress. The Strategic Arms Limitation Treaty that was signed by President Carter is not going to be ratified. He said, we can't go anywhere. We've got nothing to lose by going into Afghanistan.
And there's also another point, too. We actually went to Afghanistan in 1983 with Roger Fisher from the Harvard Negotiation Project, specifically to see if there was a chance the Soviets could be negotiated out. And at that point, we came back with the news that, yes, the Soviets were desperate to get out, were looking for a way to effectively save face. And what we discovered back here in the United States was that the mainstream media had no interest. We did this with Nightline. It was clear from the way the story was framed on Nightline that there was no real possibility. So let's not even pursue this. So the whole idea of Charlie Wilson's War, for instance, was to basically push the Soviets out of Afghanistan. Well, in 1983, they were begging to get out of Afghanistan. But what had to happen was the insurgency from Pakistan had to end.
Their objective, I think, is pretty clear now, that they actually, that's the last thing they wanted was the Soviet Union to get out of Afghanistan.
Exactly.
Tie them down, weaken them.
That was exactly time.
All right, so just to kind of give some big sweeps to this. So you've got this period. The U.S. policy is to induce the Soviets into Afghanistan, or at least facilitate it. They certainly succeed, which leads to years of war, which also tends to, as one person has said, turn Pakistan into a country with a Kalashnikov culture. The whole Pakistan society starts to be transformed by these billions of dollars arms going this way and drugs coming this way back into Pakistan. Eventually the Russians leave. Tell us what happens next.
Elizabeth?
Well, that's when everything really does fall apart. And again, in terms of the Mujahideen, what ended up happening was the multiple groups of Islamists known as the Mujahideen began to war with one another in their attempt to take over Afghanistan. In fact, Gulbuddin Hekmatyar and Amit Shah Massoud were two of the main people who caused the major destruction in Kabul. 75% of Kabul was destroyed during the exchanges. And that actually was the precipitator of the creation of the Taliban in an effort to try to guarantee that the Pakistanis wanted to guarantee that they would have a Pakistani-friendly government installed in Afghanistan. The Taliban became the method and went around to the refugee camps where they basically brought Afghan boys into the madrasas and indoctrinated them. But this was all part of the buildup that eventually was presented by 1994 to 96 as an Afghan movement, but really was very much part of the ideological political process that the Pakistani ISI military had
together with the Saudis, I think should be added.
Oh, absolutely.
Together with the Saudis, but also the United States was very much behind it. And, Madeleine Albright, as an example, was very, very positive on backing the Taliban. And she considered them to be a cleansing force.
From one angle, it gets vilified, this nurturing of the Taliban. But from Pakistan's national interest, don't they have a right? They had utter chaos on their borders. In fact, the Taliban, if I understand it correctly, certainly at least in the early days, were quite welcomed by the Afghan people as getting rid of the terrible lawlessness, the culture of rape of young, especially young boys, and I mean hundreds of thousands of people that were killed in this inter-warlord fighting. That from Pakistan's interest and just from Afghans' interest, there was a stabilizing factor there, was there not?
Well, when you're going from hell to basically a lesser hell, I guess there may be some kind of
especially a hell that they could say was mostly U.S. policy created, not Pakistan policy created.
Exactly. But I think that the embracing of the Taliban was because the Afghan people actually believed that the Taliban was an authentic Afghan movement. And of course, what ended up happening was you ended up with ethnic cleansing. You ended up with the type of Sharia law that was implemented was absolutely unseen and unexperienced by the Afghan people. There was no relationship to the kind of Islam being practiced by the Taliban that historically had ever been connected to the Afghan experience. So what ended up happening was, yes, there was a level at which there was some kind of stability, and certainly Pashtuns definitely, in that sense, had the advantage over the other ethnic groups that were being slaughtered. But the idea that this was somehow, really an expression of the Afghan people, or a solution that the Afghans embraced, no, it was never that.
I remember reading reports back in the 1990s and talking to people who'd come out of Afghanistan who were telling us that up to 50% of the Taliban in the 1995-1996 time period were Pakistani regulars who had resigned they'd resigned their commission in the Pakistani army, and they'd put on the black coal under their eyes and the black turban and gone to fight as Taliban. So this was very much a mixed group from very early on. And a lot of the Afghan Taliban, of course, were becoming very disillusioned during that time period. Now, Taliban is kind of a generic, as it is. A Talib is a fighter, a seeker of the light. So this goes back a long time in terms of what the name is. And there's been kind of a broad brush of what the Taliban are. But you can't really go in there with this kind of American attitude and say, well, this is Pakistan and this is Afghanistan. You've got tribes, you've got nationalist issues here, and of course, as Liz mentioned earlier, you've got this incredible issue of Baluch nationalism, Sindh nationalism, Pashtun nationalism. That it's all very much an aspect of what's going on right now and complicating the issue.
Let's jump ahead. So 9/11 takes place. You have the overthrow of the Taliban government. When I'm there in the spring of 2002, the Taliban are hardly present, but I have to say, I must have heard 100 times, if not more, if there's one thing we hate as much of the Taliban, speaking to ordinary Afghans, it's all the warlords the Americans have just brought back into power. And the warlords who were responsible for the hundreds of thousands of deaths. And the Afghan people have been caught between all these different political forces, all vying for their own national interest. I suppose there's one thing is that Pakistan gets vilified here. Whereas and as much as Pakistan's national interest certainly does get imposed into the Afghan situation, it's the U.S. national interest that's probably caused more trouble.
Without the United States, Pakistan really wouldn't have had the power to overwhelm Afghanistan. So there's no question that the U.S. always viewed Pakistan as a hedge against the Soviet Union. It was very much the Cold War thinking that established the kind of relationship that the U.S. had with Pakistan. And Afghanistan never, ever even entered into the equation. Afghanistan was nothing to the United States.
Okay, in the next segment of our interview, let's continue the discussion, because we haven't even mentioned the word India yet, and the way the Pakistan-Indian rivalry affects the Afghan situation. And of course, there's the recent, so-called recent discovery of what they're calling the Saudi Arabia of lithium and gold and all kinds of fabulous amounts of minerals, apparently, how that's going to affect the situation. Please join us for the next segment of our interview on the Real News Network.